Hello again, this is Mr. Nash, and this is a video devoted specifically to news writing. Now, I have a few slides to go through with you today about this very important style of journalistic writing, and I know I try to keep my videos to around 5 minutes. There's danger that this one might go just a tad over, but hopefully not. But there's some super important information I want to share with you about writing news stories specifically. So let's get started. The first thing is when we talk about really any sort of journalistic writing, it seems kind of silly to say it, but it's about people. When we try to look at any type of news story, whether this be, again, for student journalism, this be about national journalism, we are hopefully, when we are a news organization or we're a journalist ourselves, we're trying to find news about the way that the events of the world affect people. Now, that could be a feature story. That could be a months-long process to find out about, the impact that a long-term policy has on someone's life. But if we're talking about news writing, we are looking for the impact of that particular event on individuals that we may or may not know, maybe that we go to school with, or maybe they're part of our community. But we are looking for the immediate impact in the news story about people. Another important thing to remember is to have an angle. A lot of times we get we give a lot of flack to the press because they are biased or because they have a spin that they put on an article. And remember, when we think about our elements of journalism that we discussed, that historically and even in present day, journalists are supposed to have bias. They are supposed to have an angle. They are supposed to have whatever words you want to put there. They're human beings, and they're human beings telling a story. There is nothing wrong with a journalist who has opinions, even in a news story. But what is key is that next thing that comes up with that, which is that we keep it objective, not in our telling of the story, but in our the way that we source our stories, the people that we talk to, that we don't only present one side of a story. It may be our side of the story, but we have an obligation as journalists to present all sides of stories. Now, I kind of went through just some headlines there in the last bullet about how can you have an angle, how can you be a person and write a news story without making it an opinion piece or an editorial. And we said just some headlines there was, team tackles a national competition, or big ask for a first-year coach. That's kind of funny. Local business needs funds to avoid closure. These, in and of themselves, evince, a particular position that the journalist is taking. However, presenting all sides of the story is the journalistic obligation as far as objectiveness goes. As it says there, best way to do that is to quote people. Speaking of quoting people, do it. Do it a lot, especially in news stories, where some really great news stories have very little writing from the journalist. Little more than sort of some introductions and transitions. And that introduction that we'll talk about, which is called the lead, that's coming up next, is a super important element of news writing. Maybe the most important thing that the journalist himself or herself writes, but then let the people who are telling the story actually tell the story. Don't get flowery. And this is a hard one, especially people who actually like to write or fancy themselves good writers, is keeping paragraphs short. You might be surprised to hear that in a good news story, your paragraphs may not be more than a sentence or two long, but you may have a whole lot of them. If you're used to a 5-paragraph essay, news stories are not going to be 5-paragraph essays. They may be 20, 30 paragraphs because you're only doing 1 to 2 sentences per paragraph. And remember, in news, we are trying to tell a story in as concise and direct a way as possible. So lots of description and flowery sort of additions are not going to be as welcome.